Picture a dying woman who knows too much and a watcher whose duty it is to listen and keep quiet while outside a forest waits to remember. This is the story about a truth that stops at the door and a death meant to pass unnoticed.
The room had been arranged for dying long before Lady Geoffroy began to do so. She knew the end was close and had begged Lord Geoffroy to take their daughters to Length and spare them the ordeal of witnessing what was to pass. This he had agreed to willingly, mainly because he was less emotionally equipped to see it for himself than they were. He sent word to Meriden for the healer and left shortly after Alys arrived, telling the household to make all the necessary accommodations for her, and for his steward to send word when the end came. There was no final goodbye. She didn't ask for him again, and he told himself that he had respected her wishes. Alys could tell by the way the servants had stripped the surfaces bare and piled fresh linen on the tables that she was there for an ending. A chair was drawn up close enough to the bed that a watcher might be mistaken for family. Even the candles had been chosen with care, with the warm golden yellow of the beeswax adding honey to the air. Lady Geoffroy lay beneath several quilts, and her skin burned under Alice's hand as she felt the tremors run through her stricken patient. The window was open, and the curtain rippled now and then, permitting a cooling breeze to enter. Far beyond the castle grounds, the woldwood watched and listened, a dark mass at the edges of the estate. Alys made to shut the window, and Lady Geoffroy found her voice. "Leave it," she rasped, and when Alys hesitated, "Leave it." "My lady, you'll chill," Alys replied, keeping her tone gentle. She knew how quickly fear could harden into anger with a sick noble. Lady Geoffroy's eyes had opened and were startling in their clarity. "Code doesn't come through glass," she said. "Not that kind." Alys had dutifully opened the window again. There were ways to keep someone alive, and there were ways to keep them from suffering. Sometimes the two did not agree, and you had to choose which refusal would do less harm. Now, as the night stretched onward, she sat beside the bed with a bowl of cooled water and a cloth, wiping sweat from Lady Geoffroy's brow. The household had quieted. Once, the new steward, Osric Dyer, had appeared in the doorway, his mouth half open, ready to speak. Alys had looked at him, and he had nodded once, closed it again, and retreated. There was a man who wanted to be elsewhere, Alys thought. Lady Geoffroy's mouth moved in a silent struggle, trying to speak words that would not form. Her breathing was sometimes shallow and rapid, and sometimes so slow that Alys found herself counting between the breaths, wondering if the next would come. She lifted a cup of water and pressed it to Lady Geoffroy's lips. A little of it made it down beyond the coughing and was swallowed with great effort. "Slowly," Alys murmured. Lady Geoffroy gave an utterance that might have been a laugh before the illness. "Slowly," she echoed, and then her fingers slid out from beneath the quilt and searched along the sheets, groping for some unknown object. Alys took her hand and was surprised at how her grip tightened with such surprising strength. "Don't let them," Lady Geoffroy said. Alys leaned closer. "Don't let who, my lady?" Lady Geoffroy's eyelids fluttered, and she looked toward the window and spoke. "They listen." Alys had tended delirium enough to know the forms it took. Fear could make a mind invent watchers out of the shadows and voices out of the wind. Still, Something in the way the lady spoke made Alice's skin prickle. "Who listens?" she asked. Lady Geoffroy stared at a point somewhere beyond the room. "Roots," she said. "Roots listen. They hear everything." Alys squeezed her hand gently, hoping touch might anchor her mind. "Drink again," she said, only this time Lady Geoffroy let the cup touch her lips, but did not drink. Her eyes opened, abrupt and focused, and fixed on Alice's satchel, on the opposite side of the bed, resting on a chair. "Do you still carry it?" she asked. The satchel was not secret, but what lay within it was. She had learned long ago that in families of rank, people pretended not to know the tools that made suffering shorter. They wanted mercy to be both available and invisible. "Carry what?" Alys replied. "The small kindness," Lady Geoffroy said. "The bitter one." No. Lady Geoffroy's focus did not waver. "You do," she snapped. "You keep it for men who beg prettily and women who beg badly. You keep it for accidents in barns and soldiers who cannot breathe and children who are already gone but won't stop crying." "I won't give it to you, my lady," Alys said. Lady Geoffroy exhaled deeply through her nose. "You think I ask because it hurts." Alys could not stop herself. "Doesn't it?" "It does," Lady Geoffroy said, and irritation crossed her face. "But pain is manageable and honest. This is timing." The words came out with great effort. "If I die the wrong way, it will have time." Alys, not wishing to be impatient with the sick woman's mumbling, sustained the conversation. "Time for what?" Lady Geoffroy's fingers twitched in Alys's grasp, and she tried to speak but failed. For a moment she grimaced, but it was not pain. It was fear, raw and undignified. "To notice," she said after a pause. Alys rose. She needed motion, so she crossed to the hearth, rearranged a log with the iron, and watched the sparks drift up and die. When she turned back, Lady Geoffroy was staring up at the beams with her eyes open and her lips silently moving. "Breathe," Alys said, returning to the chair. She said it in the way a midwife speaks to a woman in labour. In, then out, slowly. Lady Geoffroy's breathing continued as it pleased, and Alys watched her chest rise and fall. More time passed. Then, from nowhere, Lady Geoffroy spoke again. "My sister hated the tapestries," she said. Alys looked up. "Your sister?" Lady Geoffroy nodded. "Always the wrong stories. Too neat, too finished. Knights and queens and happy endings." Alys had never known Lady Geoffroy to speak of her family with warmth. The thought that she might have a sister at all, and that she might remember her like a person rather than a title, was both comforting and strange at Geoffroy Castle. Lady Geoffroy continued. "She said real stories leave something behind, a loose thread, a stain, a door that won't close." A stronger breeze blew in. She couldn't stay where she was placed. Even as a girl, she stood too close to doors and pathways and the edges of things. Alys kept her voice gentle. "Why?" Lady Geoffroy cast her a brief look of contempt at the question's simplicity. "Because she listened, and once you listen, you cannot pretend you haven't." Alys dampened the cloth and wiped Lady Geoffroy's brow again. She drifted, her words coming in fragments. A west arch that looked toward the tree line. A corridor that felt colder than it should. Laughter that came at the wrong moment in the wrong room. Alys began to see a story among all of these scraps. That of a woman who did not fit neatly in with noble expectations because she was always looking for something else. She went, Lady Geffroy said suddenly. Not fled or exiled, just went. Went where? Asked Alys, keen now to know more about this sister, if she existed at all. Lady Geffroy's mouth opened, and it felt like the answer might arrive. But no, she frowned and turned away, and Alys began to wonder if she had been accepting the details of a delusion. I don't know how to say it. Naming her loosens things. You want me to understand, Alys said. Help me. Lady Geffroy's fingers gripped the coverlet. I helped her prepare, she said. Prepare for what? Alys asked. For leaving, Lady Geffroy replied. Food that would keep, coin, shoes that would last, a new cloak. The details were ordinary, the kind of care most women gave each other without thinking. They made the admission more unsettling because they were so practical. You helped her run away? Alys asked. No, Lady Geffroy snapped, and then her bite faded into something weary. She didn't run. She answered. Answered what? Alys wanted to ask, but she already knew the question would hit an invisible boundary. Instead, she asked, Did you see her go? Lady Geffroy's face twisted, her bitterness rising. No, she said. No, I stayed. Alys waited. Her hand still held Lady Geffroy's, and she felt the pulse there now, fast and weak. I was stuck, already bound to this house, to bloodlines and duty and expectations. I told myself it was wisdom. Lady Geffroy then quieted and slipped again into fever. Her words scattered, and Alys listened, sometimes catching a phrase that sounded less like delirium and more like memory, but it was hard to know for sure. At one point, Lady Geffroy said, monk, with contempt. Another time she said, not a place, then laughed weakly. Alys dabbed her mouth when saliva gathered there, kept the cup close, and soothed her when the coughing returned. Hours crawled by, and the candles burned lower as Alys busied herself straightening the quilts and folding the linen to keep herself awake. Sometime, deep in the night, Lady Geffroy's eyes opened again, and she stared at Alys with sudden irritation, as though she had just noticed her. You're still here, she said. Alys met the look. Of course I am. She looked at the satchel again. You could make this smaller. Alys felt angry. You are asking me to kill you, my lady, she said bluntly. I want you to keep me from lingering, Lady Geffroy said, and the words came with effort now. If I die naturally, it will have time. Alys sighed. What will? And time for what? Lady Geffroy's eyes widened. To notice, I told you, she said again. Alys looked toward the open window. She could not see the forest through the darkness, only the pale suggestion of a path outside. Yet she imagined she could feel a presence beyond the sill. You think something is waiting? Alys asked. Lady Geffroy shook her head. Not waiting, remembering. Alys forced herself back into the work, refusing to be carried away with such thoughts. She checked Lady Geffroy's pulse and felt the flutter. She rearranged the quilts, though Lady Geffroy's skin was too hot for them. She adjusted the pillows and lifted Lady Geffroy's head when the coughing came. The practical tasks kept her from giving in to her own unease, but the night and Lady Geffroy did not let the subject go. She had a lover, Lady Geffroy said suddenly. Alys did not react. She waited to let her speak, a small part of her intrigued to hear this morsel. A monk from Greyholt. The confession carried a sinister connotation. Greyholt was shrouded in mystery, and no account of it was favourable. He spoke of their purpose and path like a man reciting an old contract, but when she looked at him, he wilted like an old rose. He wasn't leading, he followed her, as though she were the tide pulling him toward a shore he finally called home. Alys was intrigued. He went with her. Geoffroy nodded. Yes, he and 2 men from the border Wealds, the kind who don't ask questions unless they really want the answer. Alys was unsettled by this description of her sister's companions. It sounded sinister and irrational in her ears. Why them? She asked. Lady Geoffroy's lips moved, trying to find the answer and failing again. Then she shook her head. I don't know. I only know what was put in motion. I only know up to the door. Alys paused before putting the next question. She looked about her to check they were alone. Then how do you know it was real? How do you know it wasn't madness? Lady Geoffroy's eyes opened, and she was suddenly lucid. Because she did not return. No one could find even a trace. That wretched forest did not give me grief. It gave me absence. Her voice cracked. Do you understand what that does? Not knowing whether she died, not being able to mourn, only living beside an emptiness where a person should be. Alys had known grief and loss, but this refusal of closure felt like a slow poison. Lady Geoffroy's breathing grew erratic again, and Alys steadied her, muttering comforts that had no meaning other than to calm. Lady Geoffroy's eyes slid shut, and her hand loosened in Alys's. Dawn's approach was signalled by the slow paling of the window and a waning of the darkness. The house remained quiet, but Alys could hear the movement of servants beyond the door. Lady Geoffroy's hands lay still for long stretches now. Alys touched her wrist again and again, feeling the flutter there, stubborn and weak. She offered more water, but Lady Geoffroy could not manage it. Alys wiped her mouth and smoothed the damp hair back from her temples. After a time, Lady Geoffroy's eyes suddenly opened. My sister's name. Alys listened. Lady Geoffroy's lips trembled. Her voice was barely a thread. I have never spoken it here. Lady Geoffroy coughed and settled, and then, Lady Jolis Fry. She went because she could not remain, not without breaking. That's all I know. That is all I was allowed to know. To Alys, it felt like the lifting of a rock to see what was underneath. Allowed by what or by whom, Alys wondered. She understood now that Lady Geoffroy's confession ended at a boundary she could not cross. If she speaks now, it is not as my sister. The line had been drawn. Her satchel lay on the chair, silent and accusing. Lady Geoffroy's eyes flicked towards it once more, and Alys felt a third request approaching, and prepared herself to refuse. But Lady Geoffroy just looked away this time and said nothing. Her hand drifted out and found Alys's fingers. The grip was weak now, the last of her will used to hold on long enough to be heard. Lady Geoffroy then uttered her last words to Alys. If the forest ever calls you, listen long enough to know whether it asks or warns. Alys nodded as Lady Geoffroy's breathing stalled and slowed. The last breath left her in surrender, as Alys once again witnessed that small, irrevocable instant when a body becomes only that. She remained seated, Lady Geoffroy's hand in hers, until the skin cooled and the grip slackened completely. A knock came at the door, and a servant's voice asked in a whisper if the lady— "She's gone," Alys said, opening the door only enough for her words to pass. The servant retreated down the corridor, dabbing her tears. Alys returned to the bedside, and she moved through the rituals she knew, washing the face, smoothing the hair, and closing eyes that would not stay shut. She drew the sheet up carefully, covering the mouth that had fought so hard to speak. She stood for a moment with her hands resting on the edge of the bed, waiting for the castle and its household to descend. Outside, the pale light of morning strengthened, and in the distance the tree line held its darkness. Lady Geffroy could now be remembered, while the Woldwood remained, unchanged and unreadable.
When a life is spent serving the expectations of others, the moment of choice waits. What is deferred in youth is collected in age, and the cost is paid in both public consequence and private regret. What matters is not how quietly you serve others, but whether you ever chose the life that was actually yours.